pressure of survival was just too much? Have you ever felt like you were all alone as everything came crashing in around you? You know, like the only way out, the only answer to the pressure, the only escape from the frenetic pace was just to run away? Perhaps you're at that point right now, wanting to take a sabbatical from life because you can't shake the feeling that what you contribute is being overwhelmed by what is continually being asked of you, and that there's no one who can help you. If so, this just might be a good time to hear about Elijah. The point where we're starting this morning is in the midst of a battle of faiths. Whose God is real? Whose God has power? The king of Israel, Ahab, was a weak leader and had allowed Queen Jezebel to move the nation away from worshiping Yahweh, the God who led the people Israel out of bondage. It wasn't a good time in the history of the people of Israel. In the Lord's eyes, Ahab, son of Omri, did more evil than any of those before him. And that's saying a lot. The nation had turned to the worship of Baal, the god of the Phoenicians and the god of Jezebel's family. Ahab, under pressure from Jezebel, had attempted to kill all of the prophets of Yahweh. A 3.5-year drought caused by God ensued. During the drought, Elijah was in hiding and had his needs cared for by God. First through ravens that brought him food, and then by a widow who was able to bake bread every day because she had a jar of flour that never emptied. You can read about the care that God had for Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 17. Well, after 3.5 years of drought, after hiding for 3.5 years, after 3.5 years of being isolated from the rest of the nation, from community, Elijah believed that he was the last prophet of God. Well, God then told Elijah to go to Ahab, the very one who was killing all the prophets, and tell Ahab that the drought was over. After a demonstration that the God of Israel was more powerful than the God of Baal, Elijah, acting on the Mosaic law that called for all prophets of pagan deities to be killed, had the prophets of Baal destroyed, which of course angered Jezebel, which of course we have a difficult time with. And of course, Jezebel vowed to kill Elijah. So he ran for his life. It sounds like a making of a soap opera. Well, we enter the story at this point. Traveling into the desert and collapsing under a tree, Elijah, afraid, bone-tired, having given it his all, was ready to hang it up. In the midst of his exhaustion, he says, "I've had enough, Lord. Take my life." And he laid down to die. Elijah wanted out of the frantic, frenetic pace of life. He wanted to be done with the fears, frustrations, and uncertainties. But God wasn't through with Elijah. We just heard, and we read ourselves, that an angel of the Lord twice came to Elijah in his depression and exhaustion and provided food to renew Elijah's strength. In that strength, Elijah was able to travel for 40 days and nights to the mountain of God. On Mount Horeb, he spent the night in a cave, shaking, alone, He struggled with the darkness of that cavern overnight. I would imagine that you know some of the questions that cascaded through his thoughts. I would imagine that you can understand some of the restless dreams that he had, because there's some of the same questions and some of the same dreams that you have had, that I've had. I would imagine that he was encountering what St. John of the Cross first suggested and Dietrich Bonhoeffer later elaborated on as the dark night of the soul. Elijah, in his turmoil, was full of doubts. Doubts about who he was and what his relationship to the holy really meant. Elijah was at a point where he was ready to hide out from the demands of life, ready to give up because the struggle of living was overwhelming. Sound familiar to anyone? Have you also tried to find a cave in which to escape? Sought a refuge because you felt an aloneness that seemed just too much to handle? You know, maybe we haven't tried to escape physically, but mentally the struggles have engaged our very being, and we've wanted out of it at times. I think if we're honest with ourselves, we've all had a glimmer of that moment. Perhaps the reason you're here today is because you feel overwhelmed with the demands of living and are seeking solace. This worship space, this sanctuary has become your cave. Perhaps you're wondering, is there hope? And of course, I believe the answer is yes, there is. There is hope. Out of Elijah's experience, we can catch a glimmer of that hope. Most of us, I think, have had our moments like Elijah where we felt a sense of hopelessness, the job that never lets up, a relationship that's become hurtful, the loss of someone we love, unemployment or underemployment, the demands of family responsibilities. The list can be overwhelming as our feelings of helplessness. Yet like Elijah, we are offered hope in the midst of the chaos. As I read back over the story of Elijah's journey, a couple of key points presented themselves to me. First, at each point along the way, God provided all that Elijah needed in order to survive. When Elijah needed food, God provided. Bread and meat brought by ravens. Bread from a poor widow. Even bread and water from an angel. God provided at every point of the journey. In our worldview, that might not be enough for us. But in reality, God provides everything if we open our hearts to it. If we open our hearts to that experience of abundance. There is an abundance to this experience we call life. There's an abundance that's ours when we tap into the energy of community and connection and the sacredness that we're offered. The second observation is that while Elijah thought he was alone, he wasn't. You see, he didn't know that there were 100 prophets gathered together in caves and being watched over by Obadiah. Another 7,000 people who believed in God and refused to bow before Baal were being watched over. Again, at every step of the journey, God was there. It took a whisper before Elijah finally understood. It took a whisper before Elijah could rethink his assumptions. Here's the story again. The Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake. But the Lord was not in the earthquake. After the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. When Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" I would suggest that hope came alive as Elijah cut through the noise and the display of power to finally hear God's gentle whisper. God wasn't calling Elijah to be in control. God was inviting Elijah to listen for God's presence. And in that presence to find peace. The Holy One was there for Elijah in the midst of all the confusion, in the midst of the depression, in the midst of the frantic, frenetic pace of life. The Holy One was providing for Elijah, providing material needs, relationship needs, and spiritual needs. I would offer that the Holy One is here for you too, offering the assurance of a peace that you can experience, inviting you out of the cave and into life. The good news to be celebrated is that we don't have to be overpowered by the demands around us, and we aren't going to be overpowered by a God that is fearsome or hidden from us. We're invited to come out of the cave, to listen, and bask in the refreshing light of a God of love. We're invited to gain strength through the God of compassion. The sacred is gently whispering to us, to you and to me, to everyone, inviting us to gain strength for the journey that we're on, inviting us to cut through the chaos and the turmoil. Allow God's whisper to be heard. Just a thought.